Okay, welcome back. I think this is our fourth lesson where we are going to revise salts and QA together at the same time. Now, we will not be copying out a lot. We will not be copying out a whole new summary for salts and QA. Especially for salt prep, I think it's a matter of reading through your notes, which is this set of notes that we went through last year. Okay, so there are three main barriers to salt preparation. Number one, the solubility rules of the salts. Number two, the method used to make each type of salt. Number three, the starting materials used for every single method. So knowing that there are three barriers to salt prep, you must learn what are the three barriers, okay? So first, let's start off with the solubility rules. Okay, so the solubility rules are all listed here, all right? But if you would like a rewording of these solubility rules, they are basically 5 rules for short. Okay, so the 5 rules are: rule number 1, all sodium, potassium, and ammonium salts are soluble. Okay, so long as the salt contains sodium, potassium, or ammonium ions, it will definitely be soluble in water. That's rule number 1. Okay, so this is rule number 1 because it's the most general and catch-all rule, because there's no exception to this. So long as there's sodium, potassium, and ammonium, it will definitely be soluble in water. Rule number 2, all nitrates are soluble. So long as there's a nitrate ion in the salt, it will be soluble. All right, so this is regardless whether it's copper 2 nitrate, iron 2 nitrate, aluminium nitrate, so on and so forth. So long as there's a nitrate ion, it will be soluble in water. That is rule number 2. Rule number 3. Okay, rule number 4 is where you start having exceptions to the rule. So rule number 3 is about sulfates. All sulfates are soluble in water except for ClB, calcium, lead-2 sulfate, barium sulfate. Okay, so ClB, calcium, lead, barium. These are the 3 sulfates which are insoluble in water. Rule number 4 is about chlorides. So all chlorides are soluble except for lead-2 chloride, silver chloride. Okay, so lead-2 chloride, silver chloride are insoluble in water. Rule number 5 is about carbonates, oxides, and hydroxides. Now, rule number 5 is a bit unique because all carbonates, oxides, and hydroxides are insoluble. So the default is insoluble, except for sodium, potassium, ammonium. Okay, now there's a disclaimer for rule number 5 though, right? The disclaimer is that actually there are more exceptions to the rule. It's just that they're not so commonly tested, they're not so commonly discussed. Take, for example, barium hydroxide is actually soluble in water. Okay, so the metals at the bottom of group 2 tend to form soluble hydroxides. But because that is not so commonly discussed, we generally try to summarize rule number 5 as such. So all carbonates, oxides, and hydroxides are insoluble except for the ones that are SPA, sodium, potassium, ammonium. Okay, now there's one more thing that I should add to these 5 rules. Beyond memorizing these 5 rules, okay, you need to really know how to apply them. Obviously, this is important for salt preparation because SPA salts are prepared using a different method from the rest. Insoluble salts are prepared using a different method from the rest as well. So knowing the insoluble salts and the SPA salts is crucial. SPA is easy. From the name, you can tell it's sodium, potassium, or ammonium. But the insoluble salts are the ones that you must learn. All right, meaning the ClB, the calcium sulfate, lead-2 sulfate, barium sulfate, and the LS, lead-2 chloride, silver chloride. It must be learned by heart. If you don't learn this by heart, it's going to be very difficult for you to do salt prep. Okay. Now, if I may just add, rule number 4 says all chlorides are soluble except for lead-2 chloride, silver chloride. Now, this rule number 4 doesn't just apply to chlorides. it also applies to bromides and iodides. So the same rule would apply to bromides and iodides. So all bromides are soluble in water except for lead-2 bromide and silver bromide. All iodides are soluble in water except for lead-2 iodide and silver iodide. All right. So these are the 5 rules, okay, which you should have copied down last year already. So this is something that you need to reread constantly and regularly, all right, to breed familiarity. In particular, you must be familiar with which ones are insoluble. You need to learn which ones are insoluble, okay? Okay, so we have just seen the solubility rules. Now we need to move on to the next barrier in salt preparation. The next obstacle that you need to clear is what method to choose to prepare that particular salt that you want. There are 3 methods to choose from. And the method you choose from depends on the solubility of the salt, as well as which ions the salt contains. So remember, it's about solubility of the salt as well as which ion the salt contains. So let's go on to the 3 methods now. The first method is precipitation. Now, precipitation is used to prepare the insoluble salts. So you need to remember which ones are insoluble. So let's say if I wanted to make an insoluble salt, I will use precipitation. What does precipitation make use of? Precipitation makes use of 2 aqueous starting materials. So take, for example, if you wanted to make barium sulfate is an insoluble sulfate. You must start from aqueous barium nitrate and aqueous sodium sulfate. Why do we choose barium nitrate? Why do I choose nitrate to go with barium as a starting material? That's because I know that nitrates are definitely soluble in water. Therefore, they will definitely be able to have an aqueous solution. Remember, for precipitation, you must have aqueous starting materials. Both starting materials are aqueous, and when you add them together, they form your solid precipitate. So we start with aqueous barium nitrate, aqueous sodium sulfate. So again, why do we choose sodium? The reason is because sodium compounds are always soluble in water. So I can be sure that sodium sulfate has an aqueous solution. Okay? So remember, it is about the metal nitrate and the sodium with the anion in your salt. So in this case, the metal is barium. So barium nitrate solution. The anion is sulfate. So I use sodium sulfate solution. Having said that, are you able to use other solutions containing sulfate ions? Are you able to use sulfuric acid, for example? Yes. You can use aqueous dilute sulfuric acid because sulfuric acid solution contains sulfate ions. However, that's not the best method. This is because if you were to use sulfuric acid, your final precipitate contains traces of acid on it, which can be a little bit difficult to remove. Having said that, if you have done all the papers so far, you would have realized that certain papers actually give you sulfuric acid as an option. And that is a valid option because by using sulfuric acid, you still have sulfate ions, you will still make barium sulfate. Okay? Just that if you were to suggest the starting materials, please try not to suggest sulfuric acid because that will cause traces of acid to be found on the salt precipitate formed. Next, whenever you're asked to suggest the starting materials, it is vital that you say aqueous. So just writing barium nitrate, sodium sulfate is insufficient. You will need to specify that it's aqueous or it's a solution. All right, that is what we look out for. Okay, now the actual steps involved in precipitation are really straightforward to describe. Basically, all you need to do is to add the 2 solutions together in a beaker and you form a precipitate already. After that, you filter to obtain the precipitate as a residue. So whenever you are talking about filtration, filtration allows you to remove insoluble solids. Whenever you're talking about filtration, it is important to say whether you are collecting the filtrate, which is a solution, or are you collecting the residue? In this case, the salt that you want is insoluble, therefore it's the residue. You must say to filter to obtain the precipitate as the residue. After which you will just do the standard washing steps. Wash the precipitate with a little cold distilled water and dry between pieces of filter paper. So the steps involved in precipitation are really straightforward. I don't think they will pose a lot of difficulty for most of you. The biggest difficulty, of course, is suggesting the starting materials. And when you suggest the starting materials, please remember to state aqueous solution. All right. Finally, it is important to learn how to write the ionic equation for precipitation, for which the shortcut we have been told, right? The shortcut is the ionic equation for precipitation is always the same. The right-hand side is the precipitate itself. So in this case, the precipitate is BaSO4, solid. Okay, so BaSO4, solid. On the right-hand side. The left-hand side will be the ions in the aqueous state, which make up the precipitate. So Ba2 plus aqueous and SO42 minus aqueous. Okay. All right, so now we have covered precipitation as a method to prepare insoluble salts. Now let's move on to the next method of salt preparation, which is reactions of acids with excess insoluble solid. So this is for preparing soluble salts, which are not SPA. So soluble salts that do not contain sodium, potassium, or ammonium. All right, this is the method that we use to prepare them. We add an acid with excess solid, all right? And this excess solid is either the metal, the base, or the carbonate. So the excess solid in this case is either the metal, the base, or the carbonate. Now, we have already revised acids and bases. So what are bases? Bases are either the oxide or the hydroxide of the metal. Okay, so like copper 2 oxide is a base, zinc hydroxide is a base, iron 3 oxide is a base. Okay, now, so this method of reacting acids with excess insoluble solid applies like 90% of the time. 90% of the salts will fall under this category. So take, for example, zinc sulfate. Zinc sulfate definitely is a soluble salt. It is not one of the exceptions under the rules, right? So how to make zinc sulfate? You add excess zinc carbonate to sulfuric acid. So this is where you need an acid. You can't just use any sulfate solution. You must use the acid because you must have a chemical reaction between the zinc carbonate and the acid. Okay, now you can use zinc powder, zinc oxide, zinc hydroxide, or zinc carbonate. Typically, I will just remember the carbonate. So when I write out the steps myself, I like to just remember carbonate. But I do bear in mind that the metal or the base will also work. Okay, so basically all you need to do is just add excess zinc carbonate into dilute sulfuric acid and stir until the reaction is complete, stir until the effervescence stops. So why do we add excess solid zinc carbonate? This is to ensure that all the acid has been completely reacted away to prevent contamination of the salt formed. All right. Now, because we added excess solid, the next step is to filter to remove the excess solid and we collect the filtrate. So like I mentioned just now, whenever it's filtration, you need to mention, are you collecting the residue or are you collecting the filtrate? In this case, the salt that you want is soluble. It dissolves, therefore it's in the solution, so collect the filtrate. Okay, the next step is very standard. After collecting the filtrate, you need to crystallize it. So you heat the filtrate until it's saturated, leave it to cool and crystallize, filter filter to obtain the crystals as a residue, and finally wash the crystals with a little cold distilled water and dry the crystals between filter paper. All right. Now, these steps are not easy to remember, I admit, but writing it out and rereading it out allows you to remember it better. Now, in particular, the last 4 steps are always the same because it's the crystallization. All right. So the steps of crystallization are always going to be the same. Next, why is it that I choose the carbonate instead of the metal? This is because some metals don't react with acids. The metals below hydrogen in the reactivity series do not react with acids. For example, copper. Copper metal is below hydrogen, therefore it doesn't react with acids. So you cannot use excess copper metal to react with sulfuric acid. It wouldn't work. So this is a commonly tested trick. You need to know this. There are some metals that do not react with acids. So typically, we would use copper 2 carbonate with sulfuric acid to make copper 2 sulfate. Okay? Of course, you could also have used excess copper 2 oxide. It will also work. Okay? Now, so beyond these tricks about copper, there's another commonly tested trick, which is some metals, they react with like H2SO4, but the reaction stops after a short while. Okay, so if you have practiced the papers given to you so far, you would have seen this a number of times. There are some metals that actually react with sulfuric acid. However, the reaction stops after a short while. These metals are like calcium, barium, lead. So just by naming these metals, you can already predict why. Why will the reaction stop after a short while? This is because the salt formed is insoluble. Calcium sulfate, barium sulfate, lead-2 sulfate, they are insoluble salts. You have to remember the solubility rule. Because the salt is insoluble, the salt will coat the metal and prevent further reaction with the acid. Right? And that's why do we use calcium and sulfuric acid to make calcium sulfate? The answer is no. It's insoluble, therefore we will use precipitation as a better method to make the salt. Okay, and that's why calcium sulfate is not made using excess calcium metal and sulfuric acid. It's not made that way. Calcium sulfate must be made by precipitation, which uses aqueous calcium nitrate and aqueous sodium sulfate. Okay? So this method of reacting acids with excess insoluble solid is a method that can be used to make a lot of soluble salts, which are not spar. Okay? Okay, so the final method is titration. Titration is used to make spar salts. All right? So spar salts are salts that contain sodium, potassium, or ammonium ions. And the reason is because all spar compounds are soluble. So we are unable to add excess solid, which is insoluble, and then filter the excess solid out. For example, I cannot add sodium carbonate in excess because sodium carbonate is soluble in water. So you wouldn't be able to filter out the sodium carbonate. Okay? So we will need to use a titration, which requires a burette and a pipette. Why use a burette and pipette? This is because you are unable to filter out excess chemicals, meaning you have to add chemicals in the exact accurate mole ratio. And to do so, we will need instruments to measure each chemical accurately. Specifically, we need to measure the volume of each chemical accurately. That's why a burette is used. Okay? So the titration always consists of two parts. The first part is to determine the exact volume of the reactant to use. All right. So in a titration, we always try to titrate acids with alkalis. So what you notice is that the starting materials are again both aqueous, and the product is also aqueous. Okay, so aqueous plus aqueous become aqueous. That is a titration. So we use an acid and an alkali. So basically, we will prepare the alkali into a conical flask, add methyl orange indicator, okay, and we will titrate whatever solution you have with whatever solutions in the burette until the indicator turns orange. So at orange, that is the endpoint of the titration, and we record how much of each chemical you used. Okay, so that's part one, the first titration in order to determine the volume of chemicals to use. Now, you can't stop here because the indicator is there. You can't just crystallize out your salt because the salt will be contaminated with the indicator. So you need to repeat the whole titration without the indicator. So basically, you have to repeat the titration without the indicator, and then finally, you crystallize it out. Okay, so it's really, really straightforward. It is just that because there are many, many steps, a lot of you find it difficult to memorize. Now, why is it difficult to memorize? Because you're memorizing it word for word. You're not understanding it. If you understand it, even if you paraphrase a little bit, it's still correct because you know why you're doing every step. So it's more important to realize what every step is for. That's called understanding. Okay, why do you repeat the titration without indicator? This is because you want your salt form to be free from contamination by the indicator. Okay, so essentially these are the steps involved in the titration, which you have already done in the lab. Okay, so remember titration is used to make soluble spa salts. So salts containing sodium, potassium, and ammonium in general. Okay. Now, generally, a titration, we titrate an acid and an alkali. However, okay, you are also able to titrate, for example, acids with sodium carbonate solution. That also works because sodium carbonate, okay, is soluble in water. Moreover, sodium carbonate, you have not learned this, but sodium carbonate is actually a weak alkali. Okay, so this is just for your information. Okay, so that concludes salt prep. So we'll move on to QA next. Okay, so let's move on to the QA next. Now, QA is an important topic for both practical and theory. So as mentioned previously, as well as just mentioned to those in the Zoom meeting, QA is important for both your theory exam and practical. Now, whether it comes out for the practical or not is not the most important thing. What's important is knowing QA very, very well. This is because it is important to know the tests well so that you are safer in the lab. Lab safety begins with you and me, and lab safety begins with your knowledge of chemicals and chemical reactions. All right. I think even in my usual lessons, I've given you examples of my lab partners in the past who didn't know the reaction and therefore mixed the chemicals together unknowingly, and they didn't expect there to be a reaction. I give you an example. So I had a lab partner who mixed potassium manganate 7, KMNO4, with ethanol. He wasn't supposed to do that, by the way. We were supposed to dissolve the potassium manganate in some acid, not ethanol. And immediately the ethanol caught fire. And that's obvious because ethanol can be oxidized by any oxidizing agent. KMNO4 is an oxidizing agent. It can oxidize ethanol to ethanoic acid. The whole reaction is exothermic, very exothermic, and the whole ethanol caught fire because it was heated up. As a result of that, he was holding a conical flask that was on fire. Okay. And Thankfully, people around him knew what he did. All right, we knew that he added the wrong chemicals, so we were able to quickly put out a fire for him. Imagine if he didn't inform the rest what he did. The fire would have been worse, right? So importantly, lab safety begins with you and me and your knowledge of chemicals and chemical reactions, right? If you are familiar with chemical reactions, then you will know how to handle them safely, how not to mix certain things together, because the reaction is probably going to be violent, dangerous, it might catch fire, right? Now, for the O-level secondary school chemistry lab, you don't really have chemicals that are dangerous. Nonetheless, you have heating going on. When you heat up a chemical, you must be careful because you must have the knowledge that you are doing certain things to the chemicals. There must be some reaction going on, right? Are you supposed to test for a gas? If you are supposed to test for a gas, quickly prepare the test for the gas before you heat anything up. So for example, if you know that ammonia gas is released, you should prepare your moist red litmus paper to test for the ammonia before you even mix any chemicals together. All right. This is because the gas will be formed very quickly and it will escape very quickly. And you should not overheat chemicals. If you overheat chemicals, there's a danger that it will boil too violently. And when the chemicals boil too violently, they may shoot out of the test tube. All right. And hence, this is the reason why we stress that you need to know the QA test very well. You need to know when to test for a gas. Hence, you prepare the test for the gas before you even start mixing chemicals together. Okay, so I hope I've made it clear. So let's make this a priority to learn over the next 2 weeks very, very, very well before the practical sessions begin. Okay, now under QA, you have tests for gases. You have tests for cations and ions. Now, I'm not going to go through every single test in detail, but when you learn the tests, you need to learn which reactions, under which conditions do you have to test for this. Take, for example, gases. When do you test for hydrogen? You will test for hydrogen when you are adding a metal to an acid. That's obvious, because acids plus metal produces hydrogen gas. How do you know that it's a metal? Well, metals have specific colors. Metals are silvery gray solids. So if you were asked to add a silvery gray solid to an acid, this tells you that you must prepare the lighted splint before you add the metal in. I've seen many students who only start preparing a lighted splint after the metal has been added in. The hydrogen gas would have escaped by then. That's why you don't get any results. All right. So having good knowledge of the test, I know that it's hydrogen gas test because I'm adding a silvery gray solid to an acid. Therefore, I prepare lighted splint before I add the solid in. Next, oxygen. When do you decide to have a glowing splint? You use a glowing splint when oxygen gas is produced. How do you know if oxygen gas is produced? If the reaction involves hydrogen peroxide, most likely oxygen gas is produced. Besides that, if you are decomposing a metal sulfate or metal nitrate, oxygen gas may be produced. Another common gas to test for, carbon dioxide. To test for carbon dioxide, you must bubble it into lime water. So many students don't prepare lime water in advance, which is rather strange. So when do you prepare lime water in advance? You prepare it when you're adding a carbonate to an acid. How do you know it's a carbonate? Well, the carbonate is not silvery gray. The carbonate is a solid that is not silvery gray. The carbonate is either white, so like zinc carbonate, calcium carbonate, they are white, or colored, like copper 2 carbonate. Copper 2 carbonate is green. All right. Copper 2 carbonate is quite interesting because it's not blue. Copper 2 carbonate is green. Okay. Now, besides that, you get CO2 also if you are decomposing a metal carbonate when it's heated. So for example, if they gave you a solid and they asked you to heat it strongly, that's decomposition. Of course, You don't know if the solid contains sulfate, nitrate, or carbonate. But a good guess is carbonate. So you can test for carbon dioxide first and see what happens. Okay, and you will be right, maybe 85% of the time. That is a carbonate. Okay? Can? Now, the other gases like ammonia. So when is ammonia gas formed? Ammonia gas is formed when you react a base with an ammonium compound. So for example, sodium hydroxide, you gently warm it with ammonium chloride. This produces ammonia gas. So if the lab practical instructions ask you to add sodium hydroxide and gently warm the mixture, you know that this is going to produce ammonia gas. So you should prepare the moist grade litmus paper before you add in sodium hydroxide and warm it. Now, besides this reaction, the test for nitrate ions, which is to add sodium hydroxide and aluminium, right? And gently warm it. So once you see aluminium fall, aluminium powder, you know it's a test for nitrate ions. You know that you expect ammonia gas to be formed. So you should prepare your moist rate litmus paper ahead of time. All right. Now, the other gases are less common. Sulfur dioxide and chlorine, they are less commonly formed. All right. But you should still know the test. Sulfur dioxide, you test it by actually bubbling it into acidified potassium manganate, or you place a piece of filter paper soaked in acidified potassium manganate at the mouth of the test tube. Sulfur dioxide will decolorize acidified potassium manganate from purple to colorless. Chlorine, we use a piece of moist blue litmus paper. All right. Chlorine gas will react with water to form acids. So chlorine gas will first turn your moist blue litmus paper red, and then it will bleach the litmus paper. That means the litmus paper turns white. Okay? Can? Now, generally speaking, in the lab, you would expect the first four gases, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and ammonia, to be formed. These are the more common ones. And you need to know when to test for the gas. Okay? Can? Now, for the cations, there's a key concept here. We will always add aqueous sodium hydroxide dropwise until in excess, or aqueous ammonia dropwise until in excess to test for the cations. This is because it will form a precipitate. The precipitate form is always the metal hydroxide. Whether you use ammonia or whether you use sodium hydroxide, it's always the metal hydroxide that is formed as a precipitate. Okay? So for example, if you added sodium hydroxide to a solution containing Cu2 plus, a blue precipitate is formed, that's copper 2 hydroxide. If you add aqueous ammonia, a blue precipitate is also formed, that's copper 2 hydroxide as well. All right, please do not think otherwise. Aqueous ammonia is just like any alkali. It has OH minus ions inside. So the precipitate is the hydroxide. Okay, now learning all this is crucial. So please learn all the colors, all the ionic equations. Okay, in particular, the ones that are very challenging to remember are the ones that form white precipitate. So this for calcium, zinc, aluminium, and lead-2 ions. They all form white precipitate somehow. The only difference is whether they are soluble or insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide and ammonia. Okay, so learning this by heart is a priority. Okay. Now, I've also gone through this in class. Because calcium, zinc, aluminium, and lead-2 ions are difficult to differentiate, you will need to slowly learn how to differentiate them. So the first thing is, calcium is different from the other three because calcium forms a white precipitate that's insoluble in excess aqueous NaOH. Whereas the other three ions are amphoteric, all right, they will form a white precipitate that dissolves in excess aqueous NaOH. Now, so how to distinguish between zinc, aluminium, and lead? You add ammonia next. By adding ammonia, zinc will form a white precipitate that's soluble in excess aqueous ammonia. However, aluminium and lead, they do not. They form a white precipitate that's insoluble in excess aqueous ammonia. So how do you distinguish aluminium and lead? So I went on to teach, right? To distinguish aluminium and lead, we add potassium iodide. So no precipitate is formed if it's aluminium. However, if it's lead-2 ions, you form a yellow precipitate, which is lead-2 iodide. Okay, so I've actually gone through this in class. You should have, paid attention to this. Okay, this is commonly tested. Typically, we like to test, these 4 ions: calcium, zinc, aluminium, and lead-2. Now, the next thing you need to take note of, lead-2 ions. Lead-2 ions are toxic, therefore they will not be inside the practical. Meaning, you will not be expected to carry out experiments with lead-2 ions. However, it can be in the theory exam. It can be in the planning question of practical still. So long as you don't have to actually touch it, carry out an experiment with lead-2, it's fine. Okay? And finally, the last cation that you need to know is ammonium. How do you test for the ammonium ion? The test for ammonium is to add sodium hydroxide and gently warm it. So this is the key word, sodium hydroxide plus gentle warming. That is a test for ammonium ion. It will produce ammonia gas. So you need to prepare the moist red litmus paper ahead of time before you add NaOH and warm. Okay. Finally, the test for the anions. Silver nitrate. So you have to first add dilute nitric acid, then aqueous silver nitrate. The purpose of the acidification is to react away any carbonate ions first, because carbonate ions can easily precipitate out. Most carbonates are insoluble, right? So to eliminate and react away any carbonates, we first add acid. Usually we use nitric acid. Okay. So to test for chloride, we use as dilute nitric acid, then aqueous silver nitrate. Okay, if you want a short form, add acidified silver nitrate. It's the same thing. Okay, you form a white precipitate, which is silver chloride. For iodide, you add acidified silver nitrate as well. But this time around, you form a yellow precipitate, silver iodide. Okay. For sulfate, you add acidified barium nitrate. That forms a white precipitate of barium sulfate. And finally, to test for carbonate, we add acid. Some acid, doesn't matter what it is. You should see effervescence. Okay, and the gas produced forms a white precipitate when bubbled into lime water, because carbonates produce CO2 gas. Finally, nitrate ion. The test for nitrate is to add aqueous sodium hydroxide and then aluminium and gently warm it. This produces ammonia gas. Therefore, you need to prepare moist red litmus paper ahead of time before you warm it. Okay? Now, I think it's just a very short set of notes. I think it's only 7 or 6 pages of actual content to learn. But these 6 pages, you must learn it well. Okay? Like I said, you must get to the point by which if you walk along the streets any day, you should be able to recite out the test for nitrate ion without a shade of doubt, without hesitating. Okay? If you still have to hesitate and think about what is the test of the ion, that means your QA knowledge is not sufficient. Okay? Now, finally, how do you tackle a QA flowchart question? This is a typical kind of QA question that you can see in some of the papers given. We always start identifying from the gases first. So we do not start in alphabetical order. We start by looking at what is a gas first. In this case, there's gas S, gas U, right? So we identify gas as, oh, it's carbon dioxide, because when you bubble into lime water, it forms a white precipitate. Gas U is ammonia, because it turns moist red litmus paper blue. Okay, so we will identify the gases first. Because by identifying the gases, we probably have a good idea what's the reaction. Take, for example, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is formed from a carbonate. That means whatever that was before gas S must have been a carbonate. Okay? Now, after the gases, we will look at colors. So like colorful things like blue, green. These tell you something about the cation present. All right. Finally, the last one is the solubility of the precipitates. Do they dissolve in excess sodium hydroxide? Do they dissolve in excess ammonia? And so on and so forth. All right. So to do the QA flowchart questions, there's no magic bullet. The magic bullet to this is to know the test very well and to go in this order. Start from the gases, then you look at the colored substances, then you look at the precipitates. Are they soluble or insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide, aqueous ammonia? Okay. If you can do this, then your QA will be fine. All right. Now, most students don't do well in QA, not because their chemistry is very bad, but because they have not spent and invested time to study QA. Okay, even at A level, there's QA, and many students still don't invest enough time on QA, which is rather odd. Okay, you need to invest time into studying QA to remember it. Okay, Ken? Now, so looking forward to term 3, what exactly will we be doing? Okay, so last year, I've given out the QA practical guide. I've gone through the QA practical guide. Okay, so my group, I think you would definitely have this in hard copy. I hope you still have it in your practical file. Okay, please maintain a practical file. And this should be one of the most important things in your practical file. Now, beyond learning the test for every single ion, you will need to memorize this practical guide. Now, this practical guide starts off from the preliminary analysis, which is what is at the start. When you walk into the lab, you cannot touch the chemicals, right? Because the exam hasn't begun. But you can observe what's around in front of you, right? So if it's a solid, based on the color of the solid, you can narrow down to a few things, right? Blue, if it's a blue solid, it's definitely a copper 2 compound, copper 2 sulfate, to nitrate, and so on. However, if it's green, it could be iron 2. It could be also be copper 2 carbonate. So copper 2 carbonate is one of those things that commonly trick people. Copper 2 carbonate is green in color. In fact, it is very, very green. It's like a leafy kind of green color. It's the color of leaves, right? Whereas iron 2 compounds are green, but not so green. Iron 2 compounds usually appear pale green. All right. Now, copper 2 chloride is bluish green in color. All right. So it's like a teal kind of color. Reddish brown compounds are iron 3, but reddish brown but shiny is actually copper metal. Copper metal tends to look reddish brown or pinkish brown and shiny. Okay. So all these colors in the QA practical guide must be learned. Okay. Including the colors of solutions. Right. Then we have the QA practical notes. Now, these practical notes are given to you in the practical paper. However, I always tell my students this. If you need to flip to the practical notes every single minute because you have not memorized these tests, you won't do very well. And I'm usually right. Because in a practical exam, you have many, many things to deal with already. Imagine having to flip to the back of the paper just to look for this. You wouldn't be able to finish the paper. All right, so please learn the test for the ions and gases well, so that you don't have to refer to these notes given to you in the practical paper. In the theory paper, this is not given, which means you still need to memorize the test yourself. So please memorize the test yourself. Then in the practical guide, there's something very important, which is the common procedures in O-level QA practicals. So I've given you the common experimental steps, the possible reaction, and the expected observation. Actually, by learning this, you can easily fill up the answers even before you start doing the practical. Because just based on the instructions and the steps, you can already work out what's the reaction and what's the potential expected observation. And that's what I meant. My best students in QA and in chemistry would spend the first 5 minutes thinking through what's the reaction first, highlighting the instruction first. They would not jump straight into doing the experiment. Usually, the students who jump straight into doing the experiment won't do very well for QA. What's important in QA is to sit down and read through the instructions and think through what is the potential reaction and what is the potential expected answer. Do not rush into starting, okay? And so on and so forth. So this is the QA practical guide. So please learn the QA practical guide before term 3 as well. All right, this was given out to you last year. I think I made it very clear, even in last year, you needed to study the QA notes plus the QA practical guide thoroughly. Okay, this would really, really help you. Generally speaking, most of my students become very, very, very good in QA. Okay, and the main reason is because they have invested time on it. Okay, so I hope you will do the same. Make sure you study this practical guide as well as your QA notes. Okay, so thank you very much. The next lesson, I believe we will be going through organic chemistry summary. And I think the next lesson is on Thursday. Yeah, okay, thank you.